Chapter 9, Application, International Trade. If you check the labels on the clothes you're wearing, you will probably find that some were made in another country. A century ago, the textile and clothing industry was a major part of the U.S. economy, but that no longer is the case. Faced with foreign competitors that can produce quality goods at low cost, many U.S. firms have found it increasingly difficult to produce and sell textiles and clothing at a profit. As a result, they have laid off their workers and shut down their factories. Today, most of the textiles and clothing that Americans consume are imported. The story of the textile industry raises important questions for economic policy. How does international trade affect economic well-being? Who gains and who loses from free trade among countries, and how do the gains compare to the losses? Chapter 3 introduced the study of international trade by applying the principle of comparative advantage. According to this principle, all countries can benefit from trading with one another because trade allows each country to specialize in doing what it does best. But the analysis in Chapter 3 was incomplete. It did not explain how the international marketplace achieves these gains from trade or how the gains are distributed among various economic participants. We now return to the study of international trade and take up these questions. Over the past several chapters, we have developed many tools for analyzing how markets work. Supply, demand, equilibrium, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and so on. With these tools, we can learn more about how international trade affects economic well-being. 9-1. The determinants of trade. Consider the market for textiles. The textile market is well suited to studying the gains and losses from international trade. Textiles are made in many countries around the world, and there is much world trade in textiles. Moreover, the textile market is one in which policymakers often consider and sometimes implement trade restrictions to protect domestic producers from foreign competitors. We examine here the textile market in the imaginary country of Iceland. 9-1A. The equilibrium without trade. As our story begins, the Icelandic textile market is isolated from the rest of the world. By government decree, no one in Iceland is allowed to import or export textiles, and by the penalty for violating the decree is so large that no one dares to try. Because there is no international trade, the market for textiles in Iceland consists solely of Icelandic buyers and sellers. As Figure 1 shows, the domestic price adjusts to balance the quantity supplied by domestic sellers and the quantity demanded by domestic buyers. The figure shows the consumer and producer surplus in the equilibrium without trade. The sum of consumer and producer surplus measures the total benefits that buyers and sellers receive from participating in the textile market. Now suppose that in a political upset, Iceland elects a new president. The president campaigned on a platform of change and promised the voters bold new ideas. Her first act is to assemble a team of economists to evaluate Icelandic trade policy. She asked them to report on 3 questions. If the government allows Icelandians to import and export textiles, what will happen to the price of textiles and the quantity of textiles sold in the domestic textile market? Who will gain from free trade in textiles and who will lose? And will the gains exceed the losses? Should a tariff or a tax on textile imports be part of the new trade policy? After reviewing supply and demand in their favorite textbook, this one of course, the Icelandic economics team begins its analysis. 9-1B. The world price and comparative advantage. The first issue our economics take up is whether Iceland is likely to become a textile importer or a textile exporter. In other words, if free trade is allowed, will Icelandians end up buying or selling textiles in world markets? To answer this question, the economists compare the current Icelandic price of textiles to the price of textiles in other countries. We call the price prevailing in world markets the world price. If the world price of textiles is higher than the domestic price, then Iceland will export textiles once trade is permitted. Icelandic textile producers will be eager to receive the higher prices available abroad and will start selling their textiles to buyers in other countries. Conversely, if the world price of textiles is lower than the domestic price, then Iceland will import textiles. Because foreign sellers offer a better price, Icelandic textile consumers will quickly start buying textiles from other countries. In essence, comparing the world price and the domestic price before trade indicates whether Iceland has a comparative advantage in producing textiles. The domestic price reflects the opportunity cost of textiles. It tells us how much an Icelandian must give up to obtain 1 unit of textiles. If the domestic price is low, the cost of producing textiles in Iceland is low, suggesting that Iceland has comparative advantage in producing textiles relative to the rest of the world. If the domestic price is high, then the cost of producing textiles in Iceland is high, suggesting that foreign countries have a comparative advantage in producing textiles. As we saw in Chapter 3, trade among nations is ultimately based on comparative advantage. That is, trade is beneficial because it allows each nation to specialize in doing what it does best. By comparing the world price and the domestic price before trade, we can determine whether Iceland is better or worse at producing textiles than the rest of the world. 9-2. The winners and losers from trade. To analyze the welfare effects of free trade, the Icelandic economists begin with the assumption that Iceland is a very small economy compared to the rest of the world. This small economy assumption means that Iceland's actions have very little effect on world markets. Specifically, any change in Iceland's trade policy will not affect the world price of textiles. The Icelandians are said to be price takers in the world economy. That is, they take the world price of textiles as given. Iceland can be an exporting country by selling textiles at this price or an importing country by buying textiles at this price. The small economy assumption is not necessary to analyze the gains and losses from international trade. But the Icelandic economists know from experience and from reading Chapter 2 of this book that making simplifying assumptions is a key part of building a useful economic model. The assumption that Iceland is a small economy simplifies the analysis, and the basic lessons do not change in the more complicated case of a large economy. 9-2A. The gains and losses of an exporting country. Figure 2 shows the Icelandic textile market when the domestic equilibrium price before trade is below the world price. Once trade is allowed, the domestic price rises to equal the world price. No seller of textiles would accept less than the world price, and no buyer would pay more than the world price. After the domestic price has risen to equal the world price, the domestic quantity supplied differs from the domestic quantity demanded. The supply curve shows the quantity of textiles supplied by Icelandic sellers. The demand curve shows the quantity of textiles demanded by Icelandic buyers. Because the domestic quantity supplied is greater than the domestic quantity demanded, Iceland sells textiles to other countries. Thus, Iceland becomes a textile exporter. Although domestic quantity supplied and domestic quantity demanded differ, the textile market is still in equilibrium because there is now another participant in the market, the rest of the world. One can view the horizontal line at the world price as representing the rest of the world's demand for textiles. This demand curve is perfectly elastic because Iceland as a small economy can sell as many textiles as it wants at the world price. Now consider the gains and losses from opening up trade. Clearly, not everyone benefits. Trade forces the domestic price to rise to the world price. Domestic producers of textiles are better off because they can now sell textiles at a higher price, but domestic consumers of textiles are worse off because they have to buy textiles at a higher price. To measure these gains and losses, we look at the changes in consumer and producer surplus. Before trade is allowed, the price of textiles adjusts to balance domestic supply and domestic demand. Consumer surplus, the area between the demand curve and the before trade price, is area A plus B. Producer surplus, the demand area between the supply curve and the before trade price, is area C. Total surplus before trade, the sum of consumer and producer surplus, is the area A plus B plus C. After trade is allowed, the domestic price rises to the world price. Consumer surplus is reduced to area A, the area between the demand curve and the world price. Producer surplus is increased to area B plus C plus D, the area between the supply curve and the world price. Thus, total surplus with trade is area A plus B plus C plus D. These welfare calculations show who wins and who loses from trade in an exporting country. Sellers benefit because producer surplus increases by the area B plus D. Buyers are worse off because consumer surplus decreases by the area B. Because the gains of sellers exceed the losses of buyers by the area D, total surplus on Iceland increases. This analysis of an exporting country yields two conclusions. When a country allows trade and becomes an exporter of a good, domestic producers of the good are better off and domestic consumers of the good are worse off. Trade raises the economic well-being of a nation in the sense that the gains of the winners exceed the losses of the losers. 9-2b. The gains and losses of an importing country. Now suppose that the domestic price before trade is above the world price. Once again, after trade is allowed, the domestic price must equal the world price. As Figure 3 shows, the domestic quantity supplied is less than the domestic quantity demanded. The difference between the domestic quantity demanded and the domestic quantity supplied is bought from other countries, and Iceland becomes a textile exporter. Iceland becomes a textile importer. In this case, the horizontal line at the world price represents the supply of the rest of the world. This supply curve is perfectly elastic because Iceland is a small economy and therefore can buy as many textiles as it wants at the world price. Now consider the gains and losses from trade. Once again, not everyone benefits. When trade forces the domestic price to fall, domestic consumers are better off. They can now buy textiles at a lower price, and domestic producers are worse off. They now have to sell textiles at a lower price. Changes in consumer and producer surplus measure the size of the gains and losses. Before trade, consumer surplus is area A. Producer surplus is area B plus C, and total surplus is area A plus B plus C. After trade is allowed, consumer surplus is area A plus B plus D. Producer surplus is area C, and total surplus is area A plus B plus C plus D. These welfare calculations shows who wins and who loses from trade in an importing country. Buyers benefit because consumer surplus increases by the area B plus D. Sellers are worse off because producer surplus falls by the area B. The gains of buyers exceed the losses of sellers, and total surplus increases by the area D. This analysis of an importing country yields two conclusions parallel to those for an exporting country. When a country allows trade and becomes an importer of a good, domestic consumers of the good are better off, and domestic producers of the good are worse off. Trade raises the economic well-being of a nation in the sense that the gains of the winners exceed the losses of the losers. Having completed our analysis of trade, we can better understand one of the 10 principles of economics in Chapter 1. Trade can make everyone better off. If Iceland opens its textile market to international trade, the change creates winners and losers regardless of whether Iceland ends up exporting or importing textiles. In either case, however, the gains of the winners exceed the losses of the losers, so the winners could compensate the losers and still be better off. In this sense, trade can make everyone better off, but will trade make everyone better off? Probably not. In practice, compensation for the losers from international trade is rare. Without such compensation, opening an economy to international trade is a policy that expands the size of the economic pie, while perhaps leaving some participants in the economy with a smaller slice. We can now see why the debate over trade policy is often contentious. Whenever a policy creates winners and losers, the stage is set for a political battle. Nations sometimes fail to enjoy the gains from trade because the losers from free trade are better organized than the winners. The losers may turn their cohesiveness into political clout and lobby for trade restrictions such as tariffs or import quotas. 9-2C. Effects of a tariff. The Icelandic economists next consider the effects of a tariff, a tax imported on goods. The economists quickly realize that a tariff on textiles will have no effect if Iceland becomes a textile exporter. If no one in Iceland is interested in importing textiles, a tax on textile imports is irrelevant. So, the tariff matters only if Iceland becomes a textile importer. Concentrating their attention on this case, the economists compare welfare with and without the tariff. Figure 4 shows the Icelandic market for textiles. Under free trade, domestic price equals the world price. A tariff raises the price of imported textiles above the world price by the amount of the tariff. Domestic suppliers of textiles who compete with suppliers of imported textiles can now sell their textiles for the world price plus the amount of the tariff. Thus, the price of textiles, both imported and domestic, rises by the amount of the tariff and is, therefore, closer to the price that would prevail without trade. The change in price affects the behavior of domestic buyers and sellers. Because the tariff raises the price of textiles, it reduces the domestic quantity demanded from QD1 to QD2 and raises the domestic quantity supplied from QS1 to QS2. Thus, the tariff reduces the quantity of imports and moves the domestic market closer to its equilibrium without trade. Now consider gains and losses from the tariff. Because the tariff raises the domestic price, domestic sellers are better off and domestic buyers are worse off. In addition, the government raises revenue. To measure these gains and losses, we look at the changes in consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenue. These changes are summarized in table figure 4. Before the tariff, the domestic price equals the world price. Consumer surplus, the area between the demand curve and the world price, is area A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. Producer surplus is the area between the supply curve and the world price is area G. Government revenue equals 0. Total surplus, the sum of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenue is area A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F plus G. Once the government imposes a tariff, the domestic price exceeds the world price by the amount of the tariff. Consumer surplus is now area A plus B. Producer surplus is area C plus G. Government revenue, which is the quantity of after-tariff imports times the size of the tariff, is area E. Thus, the total surplus with the tariff is area A plus B plus C plus E plus G. To determine the total welfare effects of the tariff, we add the change in consumer surplus, which is negative, the change in producer surplus, positive, and the change in government revenue, positive. We find that total surplus in the market decreases by the area D plus F. If this fall in total surplus is called deadweight loss of the tariff. A tariff causes deadweight loss because a tariff is a type of tax. Like most taxes, it distorts incentives and pushes the allocation of scarce resources away from the optimum. In this case, we can identify two effects. First, when the tariff raises the domestic price of textiles above the world price, it encourages domestic producers to increase production from QS1 to QS2. Even though the cost of making these incremental units exceeds the cost of buying them at the world price, the tariff makes it profitable for domestic producers to manufacture them nonetheless. Second, when the tariff raises the price that domestic textile consumers have to pay, it encourages them to reduce consumption of textiles from QD1 to QD2. Even though domestic consumers value these incremental units at more than the world price, the tariff induces them to cut back their purchases. Area D represents the deadweight loss from overproduction of textiles, and Area F represents the deadweight loss from underconsumption of textiles. The deadweight loss, total deadweight loss of the tariff is the sum of these two triangles. 9-2D. The lessons for trade policy. The team of Icelandic economists can now write to the new president. Dear Madam President, you asked us 3 questions about opening up trade. After much hard work, we have the answers. Question: if the government allows Icelandians to import and export textiles, what will happen to the price of textiles and the quantity of textiles sold in the domestic textile market? Answer: once trade is allowed, the Icelandic price of textiles will be driven to equal the price prevailing around the world. If the world price is now higher than the Icelandic price, our price will rise. If the higher price will reduce the amount of textiles Icelandians consume and raise the amount of textiles that Icelandians produce, Iceland will therefore become a textile exporter. This occurs because, in this case, Iceland has a comparative advantage in producing textiles. Conversely, if the world price is now lower than the Icelandic price, our price will fall. The lower price will raise the amount of textiles that Icelandians consume and lower the amount of textiles that Icelandians produce. Iceland will therefore become a textile importer. This occurs because, in this case, other countries will have a comparative advantage in producing textiles. Next question. Who will gain from free trade in textiles and who will lose? And will the gains exceed the losses? Answer. The answer depends on whether the price rises or falls when trade is allowed. If the price rises, producers of textiles gain and consumers of textiles lose. If the price falls, consumers gain and producers lose. In both cases, the gains are larger than the losses. Thus, free trade raises the total welfare of Icelandians. Next question. Should a tariff be part of the new trade policy? Answer. A tariff has an impact only if Iceland becomes a textile importer. In this case, a tariff moves the economy closer to the no-trade equilibrium and, like most taxes, has a deadweight loss. A tariff improves the welfare of domestic producers and raises revenue for the government. But these gains are more than offset by the losses suffered by consumers. The best policy from the standpoint of economic efficiency would be to allow free trade without a tariff. We hope you find these answers helpful as you decide on your new policy. Your faithful servants, Icelandian Economics Team. 9-2E. Other benefits of international trade. The conclusions of the Icelandian Economics Team are based on the standard analysis of international trade. Their analysis uses the most fundamental tools in the economist toolbox: supply, demand, and producer and consumer surplus. It shows that there are winners and losers when a nation opens itself up to trade, but gains to the winners exceed the losses of the losers. The case for free trade can be made even stronger, however, because there are several other economic benefits of trade beyond those emphasized in the standard analysis. Here, in a nutshell, are some of these other benefits. Increased variety of goods. Goods produced in different countries are not exactly the same. German beer, for instance, is not the same as American beer. Free trade gives consumers in all countries greater variety from which to choose. Lower cost through economies of scale. Some goods can be produced at low cost only if they are produced in large quantities, a phenomenon called economies of scale. A firm in a small country cannot take full advantage of economies of scale if it can only sell in a small domestic market. Free trade gives firms access to larger world markets and allows them to realize economies of scale more fully. Increased competition. A company shielded from foreign competitors is more likely to have market power, which in turn gives it the ability to raise prices above competitive levels. This is a type of market failure. Opening up trade fosters competition and gives the invisible hand a better chance to work its magic. Enhanced flow of ideas. The transfer of technological advances around the world is often thought to be linked to the trading of the goods that embody those advances. The best way for a poor agricultural nation to learn about the computer revolution, for instance, is to buy some computers from abroad rather than trying to make them domestically. Thus, free international trade increases variety for consumers, allows firms to take advantage of economies of scale, makes markets more competitive, and facilitates the spread of technology. If the Icelandian economists also took these effects into account, their advice to their president would be even more forceful. 9-3. Arguments for restricting trade. The letter from the economics team starts to persuade the new president of Iceland to consider allowing trade in textiles. She notes that the domestic price is now high compared to the world price. Free trade would therefore cause the price of textiles to fall and hurt domestic textile producers. Before implementing the new policy, she asked Icelandic textile companies to comment on the economist's advice. Not surprisingly, the textile companies oppose free trade in textiles. They believe that the government should protect the domestic textile industry from foreign competition. Let's consider some of the arguments they may give to support their position and how the economics team would respond. 9-3A. The jobs argument. Opponents of free trade often argue that trade with other countries destroys domestic jobs. In our example, free trade in textiles would cause the price of textiles to fall, reducing the quantity of textiles produced in Iceland and thus reducing employment in the Icelandic textile industry. Some Icelandic textile workers would lose their jobs. Yet free trade creates jobs at the same time that it destroys them. When Icelandians buy textiles from other countries, those countries obtain the resources to buy other goods from Iceland. Iceland workers would move from the textile industry to those industries in which Iceland has comparative advantage. The transition may impose hardship on some workers in the short run, but it allows Icelandians as a whole to enjoy the higher standard of living. Opponents of trade are often skeptical that trade creates jobs. They might respond that everything can be produced more cheaply abroad. Under free trade, they might argue that Icelandians could not be profitably employed in any industry. As Chapter 3 explains, however, the gains from trade are based on comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. Even if one country is better than another country at producing everything, each country can still gain from trading with the other. Workers in each country will eventually find jobs in an industry in which that country has comparative advantage. 9-3b. The national security argument. When an industry is threatened with competition from other countries, opponents of free trade often argue that the industry is vital to national security. For example, if Iceland were considering free trade in steel, domestic steel companies might point out that steel is used to make guns and tanks. Free trade would allow Iceland to become dependent on foreign countries to supply steel. If a war later broke out and the foreign supply was interrupted, Iceland might be unable to produce enough steel and weapons to defend itself. Economists acknowledge that protecting the key industries may be appropriate when there are legitimate concerns over national security. Yet they fear that this argument may be used too quickly by producers eager to gain at consumers' expense. One should be wary of the national security argument when it is made by representatives of industry rather than the defense establishment. Companies have an incentive to exaggerate their role in national defense to obtain protection from foreign competition. A nation's generals may see things very differently. Indeed, when the military is a consumer of an industry's output, it would benefit from imports. Cheaper steel in Iceland, for example, would allow the Icelandic military to accumulate a stockpile of weapons at a lower cost. 9-3c. The infant industry argument. New industries sometimes argue for temporary trade restrictions to help them get started. After a period of protection, the argument goes, these industries will mature and be able to compete with foreign firms. Similarly, older industries sometimes argue that they need temporary protection to help them adjust to new conditions. For example, in 2002, President Bush imposed temporary tariffs on imported steel. He said, "I decided that imports were severely affecting our industry, an important industry. The tariff, which lasted 20 months, offered temporary relief so that the industry can restructure itself." Economists are often skeptical about such claims, largely because the infant industry argument is difficult to implement in practice. To apply protection successfully, the government would need to decide which industries would eventually be profitable and decide whether the benefits of establishing these industries exceeded the cost of this protection to customers. Yet, picking winners is extraordinarily difficult. It is made even more difficult by the political process, which often awards protection to those industries that are politically powerful. And once a powerful industry is protected from a foreign competition, the temporary policy is sometimes hard to remove. In addition, many economists are skeptical about the infant industry argument in principle. Suppose, for instance, that an industry is young and unable to compete profitably against foreign rivals. But there is reason to believe that the industry can be profitable in the long run. In this case, firm owners should be willing to incur temporary losses to obtain eventual profits. Protection is not necessary for an infant industry to grow. History shows that startup firms often incur temporary losses and succeed in the long run even without protection from competition. 9-3D. The unfair competition argument. A common argument is that free trade is desirable only if all countries play by the same rules. If firms in different countries are subject to different laws and regulations, then it's unfair, the argument goes, to expect the firms to compete in the international marketplace. For instance, suppose the government of Neighborland subsidizes its textile industry by giving textile companies large tax breaks. The Icelandic textile industry might argue that it should be protected from this foreign competition because Neighborland is not competing fairly. Would it, in fact, hurt Iceland to buy textiles from another country at a subsidized price? Certainly, Icelandic textile producers would suffer, but Icelandic textiles consumers would benefit from the low price. In the case for free trade is the same as before. The gains of the consumers from buying at the lower price would exceed the losses of the producers. Neighborland's subsidy to its textile industry may be a bad policy, but it is the taxpayers of Neighborland who bear the burden. Iceland can benefit from the opportunity to buy textiles at a subsidized price. Rather than objecting to the foreign subsidies, perhaps Iceland should send Neighborland a thank you note. 9-3E. The protection as a bargaining chip argument. Another argument made for trade restrictions concerns the strategy of bargaining. Many policymakers claim to support free trade, but at the same time argue that trade restrictions can be useful when we bargain with our trading partners. They claim that the threat of a trade restriction can help remove a trade restriction already imposed by a foreign government. For example, Iceland might threaten to impose a tariff on textiles unless Neighborland removes its tariff on wheat. If Neighborland responds to this threat by removing its tariff, the result can be freer trade. The problem with this bargaining strategy is that the threat may not work. If it doesn't work, the country faces a choice between two bad options. It can carry out its threat and implement the trade restriction, which would reduce its own economic welfare. Or it can back down from its threat, which would cause it to lose prestige in the international affairs. Faced with this choice, the country would probably wish that it had never made the threat in the first place. 9-4. Conclusion. Economists and the public often disagree about free trade. In 2008, the Los Angeles Times asked the American public, generally speaking, do you believe that free international trade has helped or hurt the economy, or it hasn't made a difference to the economy one way or another? Only 26% of those polled said free international trade helped, whereas 50% thought it hurt. The rest thought it made no difference or were unsure. By contrast, most economists support free international trade. They view free trade as a way of allocating production efficiently and raising living standards both at home and abroad. Economists' view of the United States as an ongoing experiment that confirms the virtues of free trade. Throughout its history, the United States has allowed unrestricted trade among the states, and the country as a whole has benefited from the specialization that trade allows. Florida grows oranges, Alaska pumps oil, California makes wine, and so on. Americans would not enjoy the high standard of living they do today if people could consume only those goods and services produced in their own states. The world could similarly benefit from free trade among countries. To better understand economists' view of trade, let's continue our parable. Suppose the president of Iceland, after reading its latest poll results, ignores the advice of her economics team and decides not to allow free trade in textiles. The country remains in the equilibrium without international trade. Then one day, some Icelandic inventor discovers a new way to make textiles at a very low cost. The process is quite mysterious, however, and the inventor insists on keeping it a secret. What is odd is that the inventor doesn't need traditional inputs such as cotton or wool. The only material input he needs is wheat. And even more oddly, to manufacture textiles from wheat, he hardly needs any labor input at all. The inventor is hailed as a genius. Because everyone buys clothing, the lower cost of textiles allows all Icelandians to enjoy a higher standard of living. Workers who had previously produced textiles experience some hardship when their factories close, but eventually they find work in other industries. Some become farmers and grow the wheat that the inventor turns into textiles. Others enter new industries that emerge as a result of higher Icelandic living standards. Everyone understands that the displacement of workers in outmoded industries is an inevitable part of technological process and economic growth. After several years, a newspaper reporter decides to investigate this mysterious new textile process. She sneaks into the inventor's factory and learns that the inventor is a fraud. The inventor has not been making textiles at all. Instead, he has been smuggling wheat abroad in exchange for textiles from other countries. The only thing that the inventor had discovered was the gains from international trade. When the truth is revealed, the government shuts down the inventor's operation. The price of textiles rises, and the workers return to jobs in textile factories. Living standards in Iceland fall back to their former levels. The inventor is jailed and held up to public ridicule. After all, he was no inventor. He was just an economist.